We hope you'll keep using that chat tonight as a place to share affirmation and encouragement with the poets. Tonight, we'll be hearing readings from 2 poets, and that will be followed by a Q&A. We hope you will participate by pasting your questions for the poets in the Q&A during the reading. One more note is that we are using Zoom's live transcription feature, which creates captions to the best of a computer's ability. So please forgive any errors there and feel free to toggle the subtitles on or off by yourself by visiting the live transcript button in the toolbar. So Anna, who's working behind the scenes, can you make sure that that's turned on for us right now? Thank you. Now it is my pleasure to introduce to you our featured poets. Shin Yu Pai is a poet, essayist, and visual artist. She is the author of several books of poetry, including Virga, Enso, Sightings, Selected Works, Ozarks, Adamantine, and Equivalents. She served as the 4th Poet Laureate of the City of Redmond from 2015 to 2017. She is a 3-time Fellow of MacDowell and has also been in residence as Taipei Artist Village, Soul Mountain, the Ragdale Foundation, Centrum, and the National Park Service. Her poetry films have screened at the Zebra Poetry Film Festival and the Northwest Film Forum's Cadence Video Poetry Festival. She lives and works in the Pacific Northwest. Chisaraokwu is an Igbo actor, poet, and healthcare futurist. Her work has appeared in Transition, Obsidian, Zone 3, Berkeley, Poetry Review, Cider Press Review, Glass, and others. Nominated for Sundress's Best of the Net and awarded writing fellowships and residencies with BANFF, it might be Banff, Cave Canem, Tin House, and Brooklyn Poets, she calls just about any beach home. I love that. So welcome. Thank you to both of you for joining us. I'm delighted to have you here, and I'm going to turn it over to Shin Yu for a reading.
Thank you so much to the Emily Dickinson Museum and for hosting us for this reading and preparing me with chisaraokwu. So tonight for this reading, I'm going to read from 2 different book projects. The themes that I've kind of chosen to read some poems around include the imagination, physical places, the built environment, and identity. And woven throughout will be some ideas of ceremony and rituals, since we're approaching Halloween and kind of the witchy time. And we'll end with a poem video that explores a ritual that I'll talk a little bit about. But I thought that I would start with a poem that I actually wrote about 20 years ago, inspired by Emily Dickinson's work in my first book, Equivalents. This is called Open Me Carefully. Kettle and cross stitch, the purposeful act of making a precise thing. Measure, mark, and score each page, each distance between words and rhyme, bound but unboxed, a thread connecting forms still uncontained. Hand-bound booklets side-stabbed and sewn together, pages nested firmly into one another, the way things fit, death, desire, and Sunday hymns, painstakingly bound fascicles, stacked in a closed drawer, discovered in your room, a bundle of pine needles. Cut the tie and unknot the bow to gather and fasten together your own signatures, your own strange Emily. So the rest of the poems that I'm going to read are from this most recent collection called Virga, which came out last year from Empty Bowl Press. And I'll just read a selection of poems from it. The first couple of poems are inspired by the instruction poems of Yoko Ono, but kind of put my own spin on her innovations in form. This is Poems for an Elean Harp, or Paintings for the Wind. Gather a group of strangers, raise a strand of prayer flags together to make an auspicious day. Present a 3-year-old with a dandelion and pinwheel. Let them choose. Place a guitar where there is wind. Let the breeze play the open chord. Exhale gently on a frigid day. Notice your breath as it touches your skin. Let the wind move through you. Color it with whatever tone your voice wishes to imbue. Steal the leaf-blowing machine from the landscaper. Take it aboard a boat and hurl it into the sea. Rake a pile of fallen foliage and leave it where there is wind. Instructions for making earthworks after viewing the sculptures of Andy Goldsworthy. As beings that live upon this earth, we are learning to relate to place. Leave a mark that's made without the use of harm, rather than hack into bark or drawing into sand. Leave an artifact behind, something gathered from the land to add to what is already whole, a corona of flower petals, a snaking line of fallen logs, a row of stones curling into spiral. Columbarium. Write the epitaphs of those you have lost on separate sheets of spirit paper. Fit the words into the shape of each golden foil. When you are done, char them to ash, leaf by leaf. So I write a lot about living in Seattle in the Pacific Northwest, and the next couple of these poems will be a little bit about that landscape. This piece is called The Century Building. In a silent bid to protect itself against historic designation, the property owners of 10 Harrison Street remove the mid-century sun panels obscuring office windows to alter the appearance of Bystrom and Greku's post-stressed concrete and brutalism, Pacific Northwest minimalism made less to achieve a fuller market value, defensible as needed seismic improvement. Variance between a $3 to $4 million swing in sales price. Board members raise their hands to discuss stewardship, fiduciary duty of an organization's stakeholders, trading on imaginary children. The real estate developer argued, you can always build a building, but you can't fulfill a kid's dream. How a pass-through funder touches the lives of disadvantaged youth. At a far distance, an abstract audience, easier still to picture than the Queen Anne Historic Society. Corporate types skirt a motion to apply stucco atop brick exterior, to change a street-facing facade, further impairing landmark status, the occupants deafened by jackhammers. Since form follows function. During the Denny regrade, property owners spurned selling their plots, forcing those who re-engineered the city to work around them. In that same vein, Edith Macefield refused to surrender her Ballard bungalow to multi-story mall developers. I contemplate grudges, bad blood, expressions of enmity, spite mounds, spite house, the acid of spite poem. White savior industrial complex. While reading a white activist book on civil disobedience, I encounter the passage of that time he evaded Johnny Law by hiding with his friends in yellowface on stage, the wrong side of Murder Creek. I think how activism, like feminism, often fails people. Like that time, 175,000 protesters armed with pussy hats marched through the Chinatown on the eve before the Lunar New Year, without giving the community notice ahead of time, never considering how they close the streets, affect traffic, or impact business on what would usually be the busiest weekend of the year. Even Uwaji Maya seeing a sharp drop in sales. So just a couple more pieces. This next poem, it's called Upaya, and Upaya is the Sanskrit Buddhist word for expedient means, or the idea of teachings being in a kind of language or vernacular in which the student can hear them or receive them, in which they can land properly. And this poem, like a lot of this collection, is a piece that was written during pandemic, during a time when there have been a lot of things happening in the Asian American community with respect to the rise of anti-Asian hate crimes. So this is a piece about mothering my son during pandemic. Upaya. We have loved each other long enough that what I don't say still echoes in the mind. I am so bored of raising facts, stabbings, shootings, assaults. My husband knows better than to tell me what to do. Speaks his care so that I don't have to eat my fear of going alone to the grocery store. I have choices like that day 1 month ago when I asked my son to please stop telling people we are Chinese. So this last piece that I'll share with you all, which Anna will cue up, is a video poem that I made a few years ago called Embarkation, which is both a kind of poetic ritual as well as a poem. So the origin story about it is very much about the embracing of being Chinese versus the disavowal. So in 2018, I had the opportunity to travel to Taiwan, which is my parents' native home, to observe something called the Wang Ye Boat Burning Festival. And that public festival, which is mounted by the community about every 3 years or so, it involves basically the community building and raising a life-size wooden boat that instead of piloting on the waters, they basically march through the towns of a small village, and then they moor the boat on the beach, and they load it up with wishes, broken dreams, illnesses, and kind of like the ailments of the community, which they then set afire after midnight in this really brilliant, explosive act. And I feel like it is very much an act of community cleansing or ritual, which has, I think, a nice analogy for the idea of the poem, for the poet being a ritual and being also the ability to let go of grief and other kinds of ailments that we carry. So this piece is Embarkation, and it's about 3 minutes long, and it was made with my collaborator Scott Kiva James. Okay. Go ahead and press play. Thank you.
Butter lamp, incense stick, beeswax votive, the occasion of poem. Rites I enact to set the world aglow with the light of desire, the fire of mind. Adorned in the colors of the 8 temples, the caretakers of the Wang Ye gods march through the streets of the seaside town. The lone envoy, bearing a square yoke, parades the wooden boat through narrow lanes until nightfall, when the barge is brought to rest upon a bed of joss paper. Earlier that night, men load the boat with handwritten wishes. The misfortunes and plague of my past year to be piloted up to the heavens, and a blast of fireworks that deafens the crowd that came to bear witness to ceremony. We observe as each of us does. Some of us bail out before a thing is done to escape our ghosts. We watch it burn. I can't unsnarl the knot of unmet want, so I sever it in heat. draw the cord into flame to free myself from the clutch of haunting. To disembark at the latitude of where I give up the ship.
Thanks very much. Thanks, everyone.
Hi, everyone, and thank you to the Emily Dickinson Museum and their Phosphorescence series for an opportunity to read my work here and share poetry space with Shin Yu. I'm going to be reading from several new works, and you'll see the theme. Sweet in the morning, sweet in the morning, sweet in the morning, sweet, sweet in the morning. After the nighttime shootings come sweet in the morning, mouths sky open, heaving tongues with the weight of morning. Good Lord, we berries of the land forced to ripen each morning, only to be smashed underfoot, buried while we undo vendettas every fucking morning. Did you know this chafing dark skin comes new every morning? That each patch of our skin holds the bitter fruit of morning? Can you hear that sweet mourning, languishing morning wail from the girls whose bodies torn open don't get to mourn in peace? Someone, anyone, hear that? Bird song is not the only cry of mourning. Our ancestors have cried long into twilight's purple warning. Come, sweet God, won't you carry us home this morning? Every single Black woman alive is a miracle in mourning. How hard they find it to hashtag say her name every morning. Girl child of the harmattan winds, rise and break, break, break this morning's morning. That poem is called A Guzzle for the Colored Girls, and it first appeared in Word Peace. I thank them for allowing space for that work. And it's after Bobby McFerrin's rendition of Sweet in the Morning. The next few poems that I'm going to read are from a new collection that I've been working on this year that looks into and interrogates spaces of trauma, especially trauma on the Black girl body. And it uses water as a conceit. So you will be hearing some themes about water in the next few poems. This first one is called What is Your Name? And it's from an interrogation of the drowning girl. What is your name? Earth song, tittering on a poison-dipped arrow, tied to a rope swinging from the udara tree in the village center. What noise tender flesh makes against dried branch. A snowless winter, carved in sunrise. Lips sweetened with the mango's juice, a mouth full of avocado flesh. How many times I've asked for more water. A song my grandmother sang before my mother was born. The machete she used to cut bush for the colonizers' accomplices. The loaded gun underneath my bed is a four-leafed clover blooming in monsoon season. the last bubbles of a drowning fish. The story I recite most, a writhing birth, the ocean's drooling mouth, an announcement in the shape of a cross, the crescent dream of terrored people, the inherited necklace wrapped tight around my mother's neck. What is my name? The lie I tell. Edge of water dreams. You, water spirit, possessed once, stand between deluge and grounding, brain treading a jagged path paved in the form of a question, path fashioned in backwater, river Rhine, and swamp. You, crack smooth stones against an open slab, carve hollow refuge under creek beds, hold back the dam, save the little girl who knots white clovers into a life raft, then sinks. What breaks you, little dove, sent to scour whatever earth waters rage left behind? You, dressed in white feathers, dissolve the wet wind, garble stones in your mouth. I, this remnant land of haunts. You, no longer gray matter, now formidable sea. And the sea turns on itself, cracks coveted scales with bait and hook, leaves bones for the hungry, pounds its rough back against home and beats against the dark edge of water dreams. The sea insists you are drowning. You open your stormed mouth, elongate your wet tongue, and swallow till all is swallowed, till all is sea upon sea becoming sea. The next two poems are in conversation with each other, and I want to say that there is some Igbo that is mentioned in there. Igbo is the language and the ethnic group that predominates the eastern part of Nigeria, where my parents are from. And you will hear me say Olubu. Olubu is also known in the English as bitter leaf. It is a plant that is used in cooking. It is very bitter. Some of us Igbo will not wash it as much as you might want to, because the more you wash, the less bitterness should be there. Some of us don't mind the bitterness, others of us do. So these two poems refer to that and are part of this new collection. So thank you for listening. The first poem is Recipe in Training. I was trained early to keep secrets, tie a knot with tongue, mouth closed. Mix mis-ease with mealie meal for the dining table. I eat soup with my hands to balance the measuring bowl on my back. Boil evidence until scorched. Olubu bu ogwu, secrets, as in medicine without sugar, as in 3 square meals of tear-laced pap, as in this girl body, a midnight snack of American dream fermented. Bloated, bitter belly in search of metal for serving. Too much yeast bread for side dish. Secrets, as in what refuses to be absorbed. Olubu as confession. She chops the olubu into small fragments, their green ink staining the cutting board's grooves. Submerges her work in cool tap water, releasing a thick scent that combs her upturned nostrils. She palms the verdant wet mound and scrubs it as if washing sins from white undergarments. She swipes sweat from her upper lip each time the bitter green foam emerges. Many times, then wrings the green mold of its nature. Many times, it remains. When her arms weary and her knuckles raw, she will put the mound to her tongue, note the bitterness still there, and know it is what has kept her alive. I'm going to switch gears for a moment and read from another work of mine that is based on interviews I've done with survivors of the Biafran War, otherwise known as the Nigerian Civil War, which was waged between 1967 and 1970. And the remnants of that war, the consequences of that war still remain even today. The title of the poem is called Chukwu Zanyu Zoge. And Chukwu Zanyu Zoge translate loosely as God, show us your way. It is also the title of a song that my parents taught us when we were little. Chukwu Zanyu Zoge. We are lost rivers. We cough maggots into air. Locusts devour our yams, feast on our screams. Where bullets fell, our children, flowers bloom. Chukwu, Zanyu Zoge. Why do gods scramble air till it's fire, burning flesh, and call this act blessed? Even the sun has fallen silent. Chukwu, Zanyu Zoge. They goaded us to this wilderness, sent us fire without flood, laid waste our grit. We till this earth and wade blood waters till empty bellies burst. Biko Zanyu Zoge. Call us out from this razored abyss between death and exile, where dogs defame our rotting limbs and wait to suck our marrow. Chineke anyị, Chukwu anyị, Biko Zanyu Zoge. Who will tend to our gardens when we are gone? Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was truly fantastic. And I love how both of you brought in other elements, song, and I think our very first film poem into the mix. So it was a truly special evening tonight. One thing, so this is an invitation now for our audience members. If you have any questions that you would like to paste in the Q&A for these poets, please go ahead and do so. But I think to kick us off, I'd like to borrow a phrase that I believe that you said, Shin Yu, which was about the occasion of poem, and ask both of you a little bit about poetry as a ritual and how you see poetry as, you know, perhaps a ritual in and of itself, or something that complements ritual, and how that has been meaningful for each of you.
I can go. Wait, is there an order?
There is no order.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Proceed.
You know, it's interesting because it wasn't really until this summer that I thought intentionally around ritual and my poetry practice. I was leading a poetry circle in Guatemala and had each person writing bio poems, which basically just means, you know, sort of fill in the blanks as a way to introduce them to poetry. And one of the women who attended said, wow, this is such a meditative practice, like something that I could do every day to re-engage with myself. And I thought that was just a beautiful sentiment. There's a way that poetry itself, like coming to the page, is also meditation and also ritual for the way that I live in general, not just poetry being sort of the act of art, but like a way to teach how to live and be present in the moment.
I think I might answer that question maybe in the context of some of the kind of instruction-like poems that I shared that I mentioned were very much inspired by Yoko Ono. So, you know, I think that approach is very much that kind of idea that the reader or the viewer of the piece has a role in bringing the piece alive and actually completing the piece of art or the experience by bringing themselves into the space, the imaginative space, shared space of a piece. And I think in that way, that kind of shifted my thinking about the ways in which poems can be these rituals or enactments that make something happen in the world. And so I think over this current collection and the collection that I'm currently writing, that this idea of writing pieces that are kind of like performative poetic ritual have become maybe a more interesting form that I want to explore. Yeah.
I love that idea of poetry bringing something into the world as a sort of a counterbalance to poetry as witness. So we actually connected to one another for the first time for this phosphorescence reading. And so you had mentioned that maybe after the program, you might have some questions you might want to ask one another. Or maybe comments on one another's work. So if that is the case, feel free to proceed.
Yeah, there were a couple of, I think, things that came up as I was listening to your work, chisaraokwu, in particular, and I may be completely like off on the vibe, but here in Seattle, I sometimes work with an individual who's been trained as a jali, and I've been able to learn a little bit about that kind of African storytelling tradition from his particular work. And so as I was, listening to your poems about, you know, uh, just experience of African women, I was really curious about whether or not there was a specific Igbo influence in your work. Certainly the language is coming through, and just would love to know if there's any particular sort of storytelling tradition that may inform your poetic approach.
That's such a good question, and thank you for asking that, because the biggest influence is my mother. Both my parents are both Igbo, and from near each other, actually, in Abia State in eastern Nigeria. I think, how do I say it? There's a thing about being first gen, being born in the United States and having family overseas and not getting the full immersion of what they experience. You only get it piecemeal. And that's a lot of how I can describe my sort of poetry practice when it comes to the Igbo and storytelling. It's literally what I experienced at my parents' knees, or even at my grandparents. There was a time when my grandmother was living here in the United States when we were able to have those conversations and think about like what were her grandparents doing that she could remember, those kinds of things. And a lot of the traditions being lost because of our tongue, just the time and the tongue and the distance. In fact, I wrote a poem about that because it's a source of angst in the sense that closeness isn't there. But for the most part, it's in song. And in the new collection that I'm working on, there's a lot of music. There is a lot of prayer in it, from the prayers and the songs that these women have been singing for centuries. And that that inspires and influences a lot of the current work that I'm doing. So I'm grateful that I can even find those, and that I still have people overseas who can tell me the stories so that I can share them, and they could be documented in a different way.
Sure, a community of storytellers.
Yes, yeah.
Powerful. Another thing that came up for me, I was really curious about your work in the world, and am aware that you are a licensed medical doctor, which is a very interesting to think about the arts of a healer. I think in juxtaposition with the healing art that is poetry. And I would love to hear you talk a little bit about those intersections. Like nowadays, when people go to medical school, there's this kind of extra education that's possible in like medical humanities. But I'm really curious, like in your particular experience, how these healing practices intersect, or if you see them as relational.
I absolutely see them as relational. And in the early knots when I was in medical school, that was a time of transition. I could see it a little bit in sort of the medical profession, but I went to Duke, and Duke is in the South. And so there are still some traditions at that time that they were holding on to. At that point, we were talking about alternative medicine or comparative medicine, right? And it was considered very fringe. But I focused a lot of my work and subsequently my research on how does religion and spirituality across like ethnic groups impact the way somebody sees their health. That was the first entry point for me in terms of how healing, spirituality and medicine come together. But I was also a writer, and I was also a singer. And I was like, well, singing heals and poetry is amazing in terms of bringing people in. Are these other avenues that I started asking myself the question, are these other avenues that, if explored, can support somebody in their healing? And why is it considered fringe or considered alternative or complementary, as opposed to the thing that gets you to that space of health and well-being? So because some of these programs and ideas weren't necessarily around me, I just felt like, okay, I'll be that bridge. Now you're like seeing narrative medicine, you're seeing sort of like an explosion of these ideas that, oh, we can bring medicine in. It used to be like you only have one poem in JAMA or New England Journal of Medicine, if that. And now more and more people are starting to see, oh, the literary arts has something for us. So it's been a journey, but I still feel myself an embodiment of that intersection and why it's so important for us. Yeah. Thank you. That was a great question.
So I actually have a question for you, Shin Yu, that your question for chisaraokwu reminded me of a little bit. I'm really curious what one does as a poet in fellowship with the National Park Service, and how place has informed your poetry, and if you would share a little bit about that work.
Yeah, so I think what you were speaking of in my resume is that I often take poetry residencies, and at one point when I was living in Conway, Arkansas, which is central Arkansas, I ended up doing a short-term residency in the National Park Service in Hot Springs. And it was a kind of historic site where there had been these bathhouses that had been had a lot of history related to them, like during maybe like the kind of I don't know, post-Victorian age. There was a culture of people taking like healing baths in these hot springs, and I mean, like, they were very racially divided in that they were staffed by African Americans, but African Americans weren't allowed to like take the waters. And, so doing a residency in a kind of historic place is a very different experience than, say, right in the woods of New Hampshire. So that was, I think, definitely an experience that for me, having a lot of interest in history and culture and anthropology was a unique way to go on a residency. But to kind of answer your question about vocation, like what do I do? Now, obviously, poets have to do a lot of different things to kind of put their kind of, I don't know, income together. Right now, the work that I do is that I write interpretive signs for parks in Seattle. And I also work with our public radio station in hosting and writing a podcast on Asian American stories, but spent most of my professional career producing public programs for about 20 years, and also working in philanthropy on and off.
So there's a question for you, chisaraokwu, in the chat, which is, what was the name of the ghazal that you read?
Oh yeah, okay. It's called A Guzzle for the Colored Girls, and it was published by Word Piece. A previous version, because poems are always living in a way, was published. Wordpiece.co, I think, is the website for the literary journal. But A Guzzle for the Colored Girls, and I can write it in the chat too. I have a question for Shin Yu. Okay, so it's about the film, and I actually watched another one. I think it's the Pearl Driver's Tale. which is incredible. If any of you guys get the chance to see that, that is such a moving piece. I'm wondering how you entered into film and the video aspect of poetry, because that's starting to pop up a little bit, but I'm just curious what your journey was with that.
Yeah, I have been making poetry films in collaboration with filmmakers since about 2017 or so. Initially, it started out with the idea of wanting to make animated poems, kind of like concrete poems that were like moving images that could then be projected into public space in a different kind of reading experience. And I did a piece when I was the poet laureate of the city of Redmond, where I actually did a projection on City Hall at like a nighttime festival kind of thing. And I realized like what a powerful medium film could be to reach a broader kind of populace and I think activate poetry in a very different way than poetry on the page does. So I kind of paid attention for, I think, opportunities that might come along to work with other filmmakers. And the piece that I showed, Embarkation, was reflective of, I had gone to Taiwan and on that trip had a chance to travel with a filmmaker who is also a video poetry filmmaker named Ye Mimi. And so we went to this festival together and she took all this footage, but then for a lot of personal reasons, she didn't want to do anything with that footage. And I had a lot of footage and photograph stills that I had taken. And so I got her blessing and I approached a friend of mine in Seattle who was very interested in anthropology and very skilled with video editing and video and filmmaking, had a conversation with him about the thing that I wanted to create. And it actually began as a poetry performance where the film was behind me with another piece of video like projected on me while I was reciting the poem. And so I think it's been this kind of evolution in my work in terms of just seeking out different kinds of opportunities in which I know that that pairing of the language with the images or the kind of expertise and vision of a filmmaker kind of bring the work together to kind of like a new level. And it's something I hope to do more of. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Because it's stunning work, stunning work.
Thank you.
Thank you both so much. This has been a really wide-ranging conversation, from ritual to film to healing, and I hope a restorative evening for all of us who came and attended. So I am going to invite Anna to share again links in the chat where everyone can go and check out your work. And I want to extend a warm thank you from the Emily Dickinson Museum to both Chisaraokwu and Shin Yu for reading this evening. So we hope that the rest of you will join us again for our next Phosphorescence on November 17th, 2022. It's coming a little bit different time than normal this year. And you will also not want to miss our Emily Dickinson virtual celebration on December 7th, which is in celebration of Emily Dickinson's 192nd birthday. If you want to learn more about these programs, you can do so at emilydickinsonmuseum.org/news and events. I hope all of you have a fantastic evening and take care.